Evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's virtual talk on German colonialism and its aftermaths. My name's Dr. Toby Simpson. I'm the director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, and it's my absolute pleasure to be joining all of you in the audience this evening and also our distinguished speakers. The Wiener Library is the world's oldest collection of evidence of the Holocaust and other genocides too, and it's also Britain's largest collection of its kind. For any of you who haven't been to the library or aren't aware of it, it's based in Russell Square in London. Our collection contains a huge range of contemporary documentation, especially of the Holocaust, but as I said, also of other genocides. We have photography, we have ephemera, as well as an extraordinary collection of books ranging from rare publications dating back to the 19th century and beyond, through the 1930s and 40s particularly, but also we have a wide range of the latest books from leading scholars in the field around the world, including those joining us for our panel this evening. From the 18th of May, I'm very pleased to say that the library will be reopening its exhibition space. I'd encourage you to visit. Please go to our new website at wienerholocaustlibrary.org to book yourselves a slot. Our current exhibition, curated by the brilliant Dr. Christine Schmidt and Professor Dan Stone, is Death Marches, Evidence and Memory. This exhibition uncovers how forensic and other types of evidence about the death marches have been gathered since the end of the Holocaust. And it also chronicles how researchers and others have attempted to recover the roots of the death marches and to explore its legacy in various ways. So it's a fascinating exhibition. I would really encourage you to come along. And so I'll begin now by introducing the event this evening. Tonight's discussion focuses on German colonialism and its aftermaths, and the event forms part of a wider Wiener Holocaust Library series entitled Racism, Anti-Semitism, Colonialism and Genocide. We've convened the series of events to explore the relationship, therefore, between two profoundly important themes and profoundly complex themes. And for each discussion, we've invited a range of expert speakers to tackle some of the questions that begin to emerge when we consider these topics alongside one another. So far in the series, we've looked at the history of race science and eugenics. We've looked at problems in genocide studies. We've examined the emergence of racial anti-Semitism, and we've considered the legacy and impact of British colonial violence. And the recordings of all of those events are available on the library's YouTube channel. I'd also like to pay tribute to my colleague, Dr. Barbara Warnock, who's joining us this evening and who's been the driving force behind the series. It's really led to some fascinating discussions already, and I'm sure tonight's discussion will be no exception. As I say, the topic of tonight's discussion is German colonialism and its aftermaths. I think it will emerge in the course of this discussion how profoundly important the impact of German colonialism was, but we also wanted to ensure that we considered the ongoing effects of German colonialism, which are by no means over. I also hope that it reflects the fact that the library aims to be considered about the topic of colonialism and its legacies, that we have examined already the impact of British colonial violence, and so we decidedly don't want to follow a sort of frame of mind where we, as a British institution, we're happy to examine the crimes and violence perpetrated in the name of other colonialisms without considering British colonialism. So that's also been a consideration in the sequencing of our events. So I'm very happy to introduce our speakers. So we are joined tonight by Sarah Pugach, who is Assistant Professor of History at California State University, Los Angeles. Sarah is the author of Africa in Translation, A History of Colonial Linguistics in Germany and Beyond 1814 to 1945, and a number of other articles and publications. Welcome, Sarah. Delighted to have you with us this evening. We're also joined by Dr. Adam Blackler, who's Assistant Professor of History at the University of Wyoming. Adam's current book project is Heathens, Hottentots and Heimat, The Boundaries of Germanness in Southwest Africa. So we're very much looking forward to reading that book. Welcome, Adam. And we're also joined by Professor Jürgen Zimmerer, who is a professor of African history at the University of Hamburg, and was actually also the director of the Sheffield Centre for the Study of Genocide and Mass Violence, and taught at Sheffield for several years. So I'm delighted that Jürgen is keeping his connection up to British institutions. And I'm sure many of you are also aware of the important work that Jürgen has been doing recently in connection with the campaign for the restitution of the Benin bronzes. So welcome, Jürgen. Very pleased to have you with us this evening. So I'm going to begin the discussion by asking our three speakers to help us set the scene. The German Empire was, of course, smaller in extent than the British Empire and the French empires, but in its impact, not necessarily less important. And so I wanted to sort of think about the phases of German Empire, whether we can talk about or think about a Bismarckian era, followed by a Wilhelmine era, followed by a kind of what you might call a late colonial era after the end of the First World War up to the end of the Second World War. I sort of just wanted to think about whether that's a framing that makes sense. Does it make sense, and I'm going to turn to Sarah first here, does it make sense to start the story with Bismarck? And, you know, I'm sort of intrigued by this idea, which sometimes is put forward in histories, that at least until the mid-1880s, Bismarck wasn't really interested in colonies. Germany wasn't really, involved in colonialism. And so if that's the case, what changed in the mid-late 1880s, and what role did Bismarck play in that?
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you. I just want to thank you for having me here tonight. So the most obvious way that Bismarck was involved in the German colonial project and imperial project, European imperial project more widely, was that he called and hosted the Berlin West Africa Conference in 1884 and 1885. And that's usually cited as having set off the famous Scramble for Africa, if you've heard that term. European powers had been coming into conflict with each other over territorial boundaries, the validity of claims to territory, and the parameters of trade on the African continent. And in holding the conference in Berlin, Bismarck hoped to orchestrate the terms of colonial conquest to Germany's advantage, to his favor. The conference itself included representatives from all of the major European powers, colonial powers, as well as from the United States, though it must be said there were no African representatives invited, which would not have been surprising at all for the time. So the European representatives met to discuss their various claims, who would get what, colonial borders, missionary activity, and which areas would be free zones for commerce. So free zones, for example, included the Congo River. So the idea was to internationalize free trade in Africa. So much of the territory that had been claimed, by the way, had not actually been conquered yet. So essentially, the conference gave European powers license to go out and sort of solidify their claims by conquering the African people in those specific regions. And this meant, in the most famous example, that King Leopold II of Belgium could confirm his sovereign territorial rights over what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, much of which had been claimed in his name before the conference by the journalist and explorer Henry Morton Stanley. This set the stage for the atrocities that were committed against Africans to ensure that they collected enough rubber and other natural resources to enrich King Leopold's coffers. It's estimated that as many as 10 million people died in what was then called the Congo Free State. In fact, once it came out, once the news came out of what was going on in Congo, Leopold was forced to actually turn the colony over to the Belgian state. It had actually been his personal colony before that. Okay. Now, that wasn't the fact that all the 10 million people died was not Bismarck's fault exactly, but his conference did enable Leopold to solidify his claims on the region. Okay, and Leopold did that in part by arguing that he was making his claims on the region for humanitarian reasons, which was completely not, that was the opposite of the case, but that's what he said. He said he was making those claims to end the so-called Arab slave trade in East Africa. More generally, the conference cleared the way for Europeans to rule Africans, exploit African resources, and dramatically change African societies and cultures. Now, for one last thing, I want to add that it's true that Bismarck wasn't exceptionally thrilled with the idea of overseas colonies at first. He didn't think they would be profitable for Germany, and for the most part, they actually were not that profitable. Okay. However, Friedrich Fabry, who was his main advisor on colonial affairs and a former missionary inspector with the Rhenish mission, convinced him that colonies were important for instilling national pride, increasing international competition, particularly with Britain, and solidifying Germany's position as one of the major world powers. So that's what I'll say for now. And
thank you. That's an absolutely brilliant summary of that first phase. And I just wondered, given what Sarah's described about the Congo, about the relationship between Germany's interventions and the scramble for Africa, the terrible atrocities and violence that were involved in that push into the African interior among all the colonial powers, I'm kind of wondering what shifted by the time we get to the Wilhelmine era. And I'm sort of thinking about things like, terms like Weltpolitik, this idea that Germany wanted to be a great power and wanted to have its so-called place in the sun. So I just wonder, Adam, might you be able to tell us a little bit about that and maybe a bit about the Wilhelmine era?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Toby, very much. And if I may just very briefly follow Sarah's lead and thank both you, Toby, Barbara, everybody at the Vienna Holocaust Library. It's great that this event is happening, and I really appreciate the library giving attention to this issue because it's alive and well. Directly to your question, Toby, I think one of the best ways to define simplistically Weltpolitik would be simply a world-oriented political strategy that was aimed at territorial expansion, financial appropriation, colonial acquisition, which of course is something we're going to talk a lot about today, and then finally military prowess. We could add, of course, a lot of things to that, of course, but I think really those components make up what becomes Weltpolitik. And I think it would be somewhat simplistic of me to say that it was a reaction exclusively to Realpolitik, but I think in some respects, Weltpolitik is divorced from it ever so slightly, because unlike Bismarck's strategy of really having a strong Germany on the European continent, very cognizant of what was going on in Central Europe and elsewhere on the continent, Weltpolitik, of course, was more world-oriented. And also, and this is not to say that Realpolitik was inherently pragmatic. Bismarck and many of his supporters thought it was, divorcing ideology away from decisions, where of course Weltpolitik was not that at all in all of its components. And I think the Wilhelmine era really represents that in all of these, unfortunately, very violent ways that I think we're going to be talking about today. And your question about maybe why people support it or who were they, I'm thinking of the group that I know Jeff Ely and a lot of folks have talked about for a long time, many others since his first works, the so-called New German Right. So an increased power and status of corporatists and big industry, politicians that maybe were more both on the center left and center right, but increasingly those that were more ideologically driven, more oriented toward territorial expansion, again, as we've discussed. And of course, that includes aspiring colonists, one that was very much centered on making Germany a global great power. And perhaps the man, nothing of course is monolithic in history, but the man that perhaps personified this the best, hence the name of the era, is Wilhelmine II. Kaiser Wilhelm II, excuse me. Your question is not about him, but I can't help but think of the late great Thomas Nipperdey in his description of who he was and what he represented. I have the quote here: someone with an immeasurably exaggerated self-confidence and desire to show off, a juvenile cadet who brashly wanted to play the part of the supreme warlord. And I think that very much encapsulates, out of context, of course, this is a very long description that Nipperdey provides, but that very much encapsulates what this comes to define for Weltpolitik, at least with respect to Germany. But maybe just to close this initial answer, then why does colonialism become a part of it? Why couldn't it have still remained, for instance, something that was more focused on the European continent? I think for a number of reasons that were not unique to Germany. And this is going to be, I think, a common theme, not just of me, but I think for the other panelists. Colonial expansion at that time meant global status and increasing one's global status, one's power. Size and might makes right. Economic and strategic initiatives and so-called economic potentials. The British and the Germans and the French trying to colonize certain spaces around the world for strategic purposes, always looking to a potential future war, but also for their own economic gain. And this, of course, was not just for national purposes. This was also for individuals. If we're talking about German Southwest Africa, of course, it begins, as I've written about and many others, as an economic boondoggle in many respects, as I would define it. Adolf Luderitz, Karl Peters in German East Africa. So that's a component. And then finally, empire represented something that could potentially be a solution for so-called, and I do emphasize heavily, so-called social problems, sending people less desirable, so-called, to peripheral expanses, but also establishing settler colonies, so-called cultural fertilizer didn't dissipate into other regions and other states, such as the United States and elsewhere. So I think all of those components represent and make up Weltpolitik in this specific context. And though we're specifically and rightly talking about Germany here, these components, of course, were present in every colonial project at this time, European and non-European. And I think that's an important point to emphasize here. Thank you, Adam.
That's again a brilliant summary. So I'm going to turn to Jürgen now. So Jürgen, the timeline of German colonialism is often said to end abruptly after the end of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, the removal of Germany's colonies. However, you've recently sort of made the argument that colonialism within German politics remained very important beyond that, perhaps until the end of the Second World War, or even beyond the end of the Second World War. So I wonder if you could just tell us a bit how you see that, perhaps the moment of the First World War and what it meant for colonialism in German politics thereafter.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be part of this panel and to discuss these important topics. I mean, the question you raised now is at the heart of the matter, and we have to talk about what does colonialism mean, because there is a tendency, and that is part of your question, saying colonialism or German colonialism is former colonial empire, starting in 1884, ending in 1950, 14, 15, 18, 19, and then it's over. But in reality, the engagement of Germans, people we would now call Germans, because they would now live within the boundaries of Germany, started a lot earlier. It started 500 years ago in the 16th century, and it did not end in 1918-19. So that is the first part the first argument I would make. So colonialism, and that ties in to the question about Bismarck and Weltpolitik, is a response by by part of German society to a worldview which sees itself in a social Darwinian struggle of all against all, and in which the nation, which in a biopolitical interpretation of history, the nation which has the greatest resources, the greatest number of members, would prevail at the end. And if you take this, then you get a social Darwinian attempt to create colonies overseas, and then this geographical focus shifted from the south to the east. And then you suddenly have the history of the Third Reich and the war of conquest and annihilation in Eastern Europe after 1939-41 as part of the same drive to conquer Lebensraum. You just need to think about colonial space and Lebensraum as basically meaning this or meaning the same. you want to conquer space, which, and then I think there is a similarity between the southern and the eastern colonization, which you then control by a certain race, by a racialized society, with Germans at the Herrenmenschen, at the top level, and that combines both. And if you see it in that way, that you have a second attempt at the former colonial empire, starting in 1938, 39, and then ending in 1945, which is interesting because that makes actually the end of World War II and the forced expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe as actually the moment of decolonization. Because from then on, the expansive move, so far at least, to the east stopped and was reversed. And I would argue that you have to understand the first colonial empire and the attempt at the second one together to understand the meaning of the colonial idea and the colonial mentality in German history.
Thank you, Jürgen. So in this, I'm going to move on shortly to look specifically at colonial violence at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But I'd actually like to give you perhaps a quick chance to respond to one another's points that you've just made, especially since Jürgen's introduced such an interesting idea about having a much wider chronological span for thinking about colonialism in German history. And so, yeah, perhaps I'll just invite Sarah and Adam back into the discussion, just for your thoughts on that.
Oh, I completely, I'm sorry, Adam, I don't want to, but I completely agree with what Jürgen is saying. In fact, when I was talking before about Bismarck and the Berlin West Africa Conference, I was thinking about, and these are people who were there later, but yet before the formal empire. I was thinking about the missionaries who were in German Southwest Africa, what became German Southwest Africa, from much earlier. There's this Rhenish Missionary Society, which came earlier in the 19th century to Namibia. And there was one of the people who helped sort of solidify Germany as, Namibia rather, as a German colony was a man named Karl Buttner, who was a German missionary who had been in that area in Southwest Africa for quite a while prior to actually the Germans coming to take over. And in fact, he had originally asked the British to come and take over in the area, and then they rejected that. And so he had wanted to have the Germans then come in. So again, it goes back really, it goes back as far as Jürgen says it does. And there's so many different sort of antecedents. So I think to look at Germany just as German colonialism, just as again that short period between 1884, 85, and 1919 it's not correct. I do think it's a much longer spread. And one other thing I want to say before I turn it over to Adam is that Adam and I actually recently co-edited a book together with another professor, David Pizzo, on Germany, on kind of global Germany, on the question of Germany and the global South. And we sort of give a nod to, we talk about how, well, we don't really talk about the earlier period, but we do talk about how German colonialism begins before we tend to think it does, and that it encompasses a lot more also geographically than we tend to think of. In fact, that's what we kind of emphasize more in the volume, that Germans, even during the official era of German colonialism, there were Germans who were active in other colonies, right? And I mentioned before Karl Buttner and the British. He actually was a member, even though he wasn't, but he worked a lot with the British in terms of his missionary work. And before him, a lot of the German missionaries who went out to the field actually worked for British missionary societies. So in addition to there being sort of a broader chronological sweep, I would argue there's also a broader geographical sweep as well.
Thank you. And Adam?
Yeah, and I promise to be brief. I'll just simply agree with both Jürgen and Sarah on this issue. I think that we miss so much. We could have a whole panel on what we would miss if we only focused on the quote unquote formal period of German colonialism. Because on the one hand, it's very important to talk about those 30 years and change. But if we don't talk about the origins of colonialism, which is again something that I am in a lot of my work am especially interested in, and specifically in the German context. I think that we end up missing not only again the potentials that made colonialism a possibility in Germany's history, but far more importantly, I think we miss the potentials that made colonialism a possibility in all European colonial projects in the 19th century, before and after as well. And I think that's, again, just for purposes of time, I'll just be agreeable and say I just think that just only focusing on the formal period misses what everything that Jürgen and Sarah have discussed. So.
Great. So I just want to close that loop a little bit by going back to the beginning and that question of whether it makes sense to start any narrative around this with Bismarck. So I wonder if I could ask Jürgen about that, and perhaps even in the context of, what are there important turning points, and as thinking about the nature of the German state, which we'll come back to when we're talking about violence and perhaps the culture within German institutions like the German army. Were there important aspects that are worth thinking about when we think of how either Bismarck or Kaiser Wilhelm shaped the culture of German colonialism?
I mean, since you ask about or mentioned Bismarck in a question to me, I mean, there is since last year a very, very intensive debate in Germany about whether or not Bismarck is, or the Bismarck statues, which we have all over the place, are colonial monuments or not. It's part of a debate which started with the Black Lives Matter movement coming to Germany, basically, and the British debate about colonial monuments, and then the Bismarck, and it's very intense because it's interesting, because it's obvious it's a colonial monument. I mean, for the reasons Adam already said, Sarah said that the Africa Conference is a world historical event. It is, Bismarck is, by inviting the diplomats to Berlin, became the father, so to speak, of the partition of Africa and of almost all post-colonial nation states there. And this is something completely ignored in the German debate about Bismarck. By sort of agreeing to creating a formal colonial empire, Bismarck allowed the road to be taken, which ultimately led to the Omaheke Desert, and which ultimately led to the Majimaji, to the genocide. And you can't exclude or excuse Bismarck, because, I mean, Bismarck is famous for a lot of things, but not for being a weak chancellor, for being a pushover in this. So he agreed, and I would say, just then I end on Bismarck, he knew that the colonial adventure would not pay off the German society as such, but just a segment. For example, the merchants of Hamburg, the city I live and work now, who profited from it. And he knew that it would be violent. He knew that violence would follow. And he did not believe into colonialism, and for poor cynicism and political game playing. He agreed on Germany creating the third largest colonial empire at the time. And if we talk about the effects of this colonialism, of this decision, then we should ask the Cameroonians and the Tanzanians and the Namibians, and how they see the effect and how minimal this was, because it changed their lives completely up to today. And that we need to take into account.
Absolutely. So actually, you've introduced that topic of violence and its impact on colonized peoples, and that's what I want to turn to now. And I'd quite like to sort of zoom the focus in a little bit and think specifically about German Southwest Africa. So we will come on to discuss the genocide of the Herero and the Nama, but I want to think first about the dynamics of kind of colonial violence, not necessarily in the context of genocidal violence, but more broadly. And I suppose it makes sense for me to say, I'm sure you would point this out too, Sarah, that a lot of the dynamics that Sarah, you might describe about this also apply to colonies that were British colonies or French colonies. So I can ask you, Sarah, just to outline a bit about the dynamics of violence within a colony like German Southwest Africa.
Okay, and I'm glad that you mentioned that the same things, obviously, as we know, are going on in the British colonies, the French colonies, basically all of the different colonies. And this is sort of going to echo some of the other remarks that were made earlier. But I'll really start by saying here that violence was really rampant throughout colonial Africa. And again, not just in the German colonies, but in colonies that were part of all of the different European empires, and German, British, French, but also Belgian, Portuguese, all of these different countries applied violence. And in my last answer to your last question, I mentioned King Leopold II's Congo Free State. The violence there was absolutely brutal and included such atrocities as cutting off the limbs of hostages whose relatives did not gather rubber quickly enough. There's one particularly haunting image that people might have seen of a Congolese man staring down at a small-handed foot, which had been severed from his 5-year-old daughter. Okay, so it's incredibly brutal, and that brutality sort of extends across colonial borders. Now, other European powers, and here I would say most notably the British, later on pointed to the genocide in German Southwest Africa as an example of why Germans were unfit to be colonial rulers. But this ignored the British history, the British's own history of violence in colonies such as South Africa, or their usage of certain technologies of violence earlier than the Germans. So indeed, the British used concentration camps during the South African or Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902. That's before the Germans actually used them during the Herero and Nama genocide. And approximately 48,000 people, including both Afrikaners and Africans, died in concentration camps during the South African War. So, and South Africa, of course, is not the only colony in which the British exerted pretty powerful violence. I mean, think of Kenya as another example. So the horrific violence of the Herero and Nama genocides, which included Germans driving Herero into the desert and poisoning their water holes so that they had no choice but to die of thirst or die of poisoning, can be placed in this wider context of colonial violence. Okay, so then we have to turn to the question, why? Why was violence so widespread? And why did it cut across all of these different colonial borders? So violence generally reflected the European and more generally Western, right, because the US is part of this too, shared belief in African inferiority and the idea that the civilizing process Europeans claimed they were undertaking in Africa necessarily included or had to include severe regimes of violence in order to teach Africans how to behave. Okay, so it was kind of built into, sort of woven into the fabric of sort of this European idea of African inferiority, African savagery, African primitivity, and the idea that you had to put Africans sort of in their place and you had to educate them very painfully in some cases, right? So violence really became routinized, normalized under colonial administrations, and there were harsh punishments meted out for minor infractions. So indeed, the title of a recent book by Marie Mushalik, Violence as Usual, it's about the role of the German police in Southwest Africa, and it's about their role primarily in the years after the genocide of the Herero and Nama. And that reflects just how much violence was part of the culture of colonialism, part of the culture of everyday life in all of these different colonies, even during supposed peacetime. So this wasn't just something that would be going on during war. This violence was just all encompassing, right? Okay. So and that violence was pretty much everywhere sanctified by the colonial state, and it was exerted by Germans and other Europeans both those who were affiliated with the state and those who were not. So settlers were also very much involved in this exertion of violence. And colonial states further, and this is the last thing I'll say on this point, they also employed Africans who worked for them and had them mete out the violence. This is the Force Publique in the Congo Free State, or for instance, the African Askari, or the African colonial police, who are employed by the state in German East Africa, and whom Michelle Moyd has discussed so expertly. These Africans also meted out violence in the service of the colonial state. So violence was really, again, woven into pretty much everything in the colonies, include German Southwest Africa, but everything surrounding as well.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm sure there are many other aspects of the dynamic that you described in such shocking detail that we could explore. And that maybe we will be able to come back to that. I'm sure there are important aspects, for example, of gendered violence, sexual violence, that are also important to explore. So perhaps we'll come back to that in a moment. But I also wanted to pose a question to Adam about genocide specifically. And the reason for that is partly because the library is an institution devoted to the study of genocide. And I think Sarah made a really important point about, even at the time, it was sort of a strategy of for example, Britain or other colonial powers to try and focus especially on the Herero genocide. But nevertheless, there are striking elements of the Herero genocide. I mean, people that talk especially about the notorious Vernichtungsbefehl to von Trotha, and there's an important question of kind of the intent. So I just wonder if you could explore some of that in terms of the dynamics of the Herero and Nama genocide.
Sure. If I may just again very briefly piggyback on some things that Sarah said, because this I think is very relevant to how I would address this. I think that both Jürgen and Sarah are absolutely correct when they say that colonialism in all its cases was an inherently violent process, regardless of, I would argue, its most extreme. I'm not trying to make a false hierarchy here, but settler colonialism is inherently, in my opinion, genocidal, all the way to supposed economic justifications for colonialism, mercantile, etc. It's all inherently violent. And if you accept that premise, and this is a way to get to directly your question, Toby, if you accept that premise, and also in context of something that Sarah said in a previous answer, the British in particular, after the First World War, primarily identifying at the time what was referred to as the Herero Nama massacre, as justification to strip Germany of its colonies, and in so doing implying that that was, of course, unique to Germany. And I think, unfortunately, that idea has continued in certain ways that unfortunately, again, have helped create this false hierarchy that some colonialisms were better than others. And I think sometimes that's what we hear. So specifically to your question, what made potentially genocide a potential outcome in German Southwest Africa, at least according to the UN definition of it. Relating to something that Jürgen and Sarah said, the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885, but more specifically still out of that, what they of course were both inferring, the principle of effectivity, which came out of one of the agreements that those that participated in that conference adopted, which effectively said that if a colonial power controlled a region, they first had to demonstrate so-called effective rule for it to be received and understood as justifiable and legal, which of course meant after the fact that increasingly, though again colonialism was already inherently violent, these respective governments adopted increasingly more and more systemic forms of violence to demonstrate stability, or what they referred to as stability. So if there was a potential for a so-called rebellion, for example, they would put it down increasingly more and more harshly in an effort to make it seem like a stable colony. So I would definitely emphasize the principle of effectivity has a role to play. in the case of Namibia, notions of the so-called civilizing mission, notions of cultivating so-called empty space, for all of the pejorative reasons that, contemporarily speaking at least, what empty space meant. I think civilizational perspectives and perceptions of the world, we cannot deny in any way, shape, or form the profound role of societal racisms that existed, specifically for peoples that lived in the global South. Not exclusively, but specifically in this case, the inherent violence of colonialism, but specifically an adoption of an acceptance of racial and biological science as primordial fact. Sarah mentioned Marie Moshelek, which I think is an excellent book. May I also just add the excellent work of Lisa Todd. She's writing on this right now. Both in the volume that Sarah and I co-edited with David Pizzo. She has a chapter in there. But also most recently, I know Zoe Samudzi just finished a dissertation on this exact subject. So all of this to make the point that as horrifically violent as those conditions were, they were not unique to Germany. And I think sometimes if we focus exclusively on the genocide of Southwest Africa, which is so important to do, we miss the fact that every one of those things I just mentioned existed in every other European empire at this exact same time. And though those specific colonialisms may or may not have produced a genocide that, again, meets the UN definition of it, they nevertheless harbored the dangerous potentials to do so. And I think that is the most important thing to focus on here in the context of colonialism's legacy in the present day. But those were the specific conditions, I think, that helped lead to the Herero-Nama genocide.
Okay, so I think it might be quite good to think about the impact and legacy of the Herero-Nama genocide now. Perhaps it's worth taking a moment just to recognize the shocking enormity of it, that of the estimated 80,000 Herero in German Southwest Africa following the genocidal war, under a quarter of that population still remained alive, which is just a horrific statistic to consider. And I suppose it might be worth, Jürgen, the question I was going to pose to you is about the culture that existed within German politics, the state, the military, and I mean, even at the time, it's kind of shocking to think that von Trotha could be rewarded with the Order of Merit on returning to Germany following this. I mean, of course, there was outcry and there were major figures in the Social Democratic Party, for example, who vocally criticized the German state. But I just wonder if you could give us an insight into the impact at the time in Germany.
Well, I think I don't think that the impact of the genocide in Germany at the time was that high. I think we really should talk, if we talk about the impact, we should talk about Namibia, and we should talk about the Namibians, because they suffered. They are the victims of genocide. They felt the genocide, and the German society more or less accepted it with very few critical voices. And the critical voices were like, oh, maybe Trotha was slightly excessive in his use of violence, but almost nobody, including the Social Democratic Party, questions colonialism as such. But we have to get away from saying, as Adam and Sarah already mentioned, that colonialism in this or that case was violent. Colonialism is violence. Colonialism is racism. And that was not put into question, with very few exceptions, in Germany. And Trotha was criticized by the emperor, not because he was so brutal, but because he was not brutal enough, or not brutal enough, not effective enough, because it took him too long and he did not win. And at the end, the war dragged on for 3 or 4 years, and Wilhelm was not amused. But I would like to add something to the speakers before me, because as important as it is to concentrate on the military violence of this campaign, I think we are ignoring the second genocide in Namibia, which took place, and which is not the military genocide, but which is a colonial administrative genocide, which started before the military genocide and continued after. Because the outcome of German colonialism, even without the Herero War, would have been genocidal, cultural genocide. The plans from the late 1890s years onwards were clearly, we form a new society in Namibia in which the African population is completely transformed into a black, I don't want to use the word slave. It's a servant class which is formed, and which loses all connection to their own tradition and history, and is completely remodeled in the hands of the Germans. And I think actually that this is something which, in this systematic, bureaucratic, planned way, you don't find in other colonies or in the colonies of other powers at the time. The military violence you have everywhere. But this plan to say we create from scratch a completely new economic system, a new society in Southwest Africa, is something I think which is rather peculiar to this instance, and repeats or is repeated later on in Eastern Europe.
Thank you. That's fascinating to consider. So I just wonder if we could turn at this point to the question of colonial aftermath, colonial memory. I mean, as I understand it, there has been some effort to, well, there's been a recognition of the Herero and Nam atrocities as genocide, but as yet no apology and no reparations. I will come back to that specific point in a moment with you, Adam, but I also wondered if we could say perhaps something about specifically German Southwest Africa before I go on to other topics, because although I don't know if Trotho is still, there are streets named after him, but I certainly think there are others who were involved in the administration of Namibia where there are streets named after them and so on. So I wonder if any of the speakers might like to comment on Southwest Africa in, present day Germany and memory.
I was going to actually say this in my answer to your next question, but yeah, I was just thinking about the renaming of streets, because that's been a big issue for 5 years or so now, I think. And there have been some streets that were named, especially there's an area like African Quarter, Afrika Viertel in Berlin, where there are a lot of streets that were named, or are still, I think in some cases, named after various German colonizers, and many of them quite violent individuals. So, Adolf Luderitz, the businessman in Southwest Africa, there's a Luderitzstrasse that's being changed. There's also, and this relates actually to German East Africa, but there was a Karl Peters Allee, and Karl Peters was an incredibly violent colonizer who burned down villages, who hung Africans for treason, who raped women, and who was just excessive in his violence in German East Africa. And there's this street named after him. That's now been changed, and there are 2 parts of the street. One part of the street is now named after, or going to be named after, a female Namibian freedom fighter, and the other half is actually going to be called Majimaji Allee, after the Majimaji Rebellion, which occurred in German East Africa, not sort of in similar time frame, right? And which saw really uprising of Africans in East Germany, in East Africa, put down really violently by colonial forces. So there have been definitely there is a movement underway to change these street names.
Adam, I was going to ask you about this topic and then also about reparations. So I wonder maybe now is a good time to talk about both aspects.
Sure. To begin with the first part, Toby, just to be brief in connection with what Sarah said, the last time I was in Windhoek myself was, I believe it was it was the summer, July of 2019, and it was my first time there in a while, and there were some things that had changed that, in my personal opinion, I was pleased to have seen changed. For instance, the Alta Festa, the former Alta Festa, which became the museum, a museum to the colonial period, not romanticizing it, but talking about it, was closed. The infamous Reita statue was removed and has since been kind of taken away from its former place of prominence. But to what Sarah was talking about with respect to street names, those do remain. And I suspect that someone that has spent more time in Namibia, that of course, if there are any Namibians here, I would love to hear from them either in the chat or after. If you're aware of any campaigns to change things, either rename streets or maybe remove the Kurt von Francois statue that was still standing in a prominent position in Windhoek when I was there. So these are still there, and I strongly suspect, based on what Jürgen was saying a little bit earlier, given some of the very necessary movements and protests around the world, that there are campaigns to remove those. I just don't know for sure if that's in fact happening, Toby, but I'm sure. But you had also mentioned reparations, and I promise to keep this anecdote very brief, but I remember at the end of my first year of coursework in my PhD program, one of my dear PhD advisors brought me into his office and said, Adam, if you're going to be a historian of Germany, you have to develop more angst. You're just going to have to do that. You can't be as cheerful as you always are. And I think there's an element of correctness to that. But the reason I bring this up, I am hopeful. It's not a just blind hopeful or blind optimism that something like reparations, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, can happen. But what I will say at least is even though there's a long way to go with Germany actually formally recognizing the genocide, there have been, of course, gestures in that direction as recently as 2015 that it happened. Recognition is a starting point at least, and that's what I'm going to try and focus on, is maybe the potential that can lead to reparations. But this then opens up the question of what we mean by reparations, and I think that is really at the nature of what's going on in Namibia. And Jürgen was absolutely right to focus more on Namibia in the context of the consequences of genocide. It was felt in Namibia more. Reparations, of course, would be absolutely felt in Namibia more, but for who? And when I was last there, that was the main question that was debated in government in the government at that time, was if we accept reparations, who is that going to go to, and in what form are they going to come? Because understandably so many Bantu and Hoi Hoi and so many populations that were specifically affected by the genocide, most of them or many of them want land reclamation, which I fully understand. That is not a decision that Germany can grant. That is something that Namibia has to grant. And that is fraught, I know, with a lot of internal politics and issues that are difficult to untangle. And yet the recognition is there, and I think we need to give voice to that. But Germany, of course, can do a lot of things, and that can come in forms of aid, in forms of straight up financial reparation, and anything else that I think populations are advocating for. But I do think, maybe to close, the thing that I would like to see most especially emerge out of this is greater awareness, educationally and public and otherwise, to what happened. And I think reparations would be a step in that direction. We have an entire course, as we do almost everywhere in the world, on the history of the Holocaust. Of course, there's very few programs, if any, that have a specific course related to colonial genocides or German colonialism or the Majimaji, or we can go on. And I think that would be a step in that direction to enable not just Germans, but maybe all former colonial powers, including the United States, to come to terms with their past. And I use that phrase obviously very purposefully in the context of this discussion.
Thank you. I just to come to you, Jürgen, on that topic of specifically the German Southwest Africa case and its contemporary resonance.
Well, I think there is no chance at all that there will be reparations to be paid. They will be called something else. The Foreign Office, the Chancellor's Office, government in Germany is terribly afraid of setting a precedent for paying reparations. And the precedent not only that it accepts a duty to pay because Tanzania, Cameroon, Togo might come along, but because France, Italy, and Greece and Poland are asking for reparations in the case of the context of World War II, and that is the background against which all these negotiations are conducted. And that's why they are conducted as saying, we are not accepting genocide as genocide in a legal sense. We are not accepting reparations as reparations in a legal sense. That's why they do all this, because that is the precedent, that's what they are afraid of. Germany is negotiating with the Namibian government since 2015, and with each year of negotiations, reconciliation gets further away, because Herero and Nama are terribly angered by a process of negotiations which put them on the sidelines. And that is in violation of international law, of United Nations protocols, which both Namibia and Germany has signed, to saying that indigenous nations are to be present at any negotiations which relate to them. And what if this negotiations about the genocide is not relating to the Herero Nama, what is? And so I think we are further away. We will at the end, don't get me wrong, we will get a deal. We get a political deal, just like we get a political deal about the Benin bronzes. Germany is powerful enough to make sure the other side is happy to accept the deal. But if reconciliation and coming to terms with the past is the aim, this process has utterly failed.
Thank you. I actually was wondering, you know, it seems to me interesting what you were saying about the international politics of this, how probably the British and French are equally worried about precedent setting with reparations. So I just wondered, it might be worth just mentioning, there's been a discussion of the Majimaji uprising. I thought it might be worth thinking or hearing from maybe Sarah or Adam about the relationships between British colonialism and German colonialism, because it seems to me that both in East Africa, in its relationship with Uganda and Kenya, there's a very important interaction with British colonialism there. And then also in the Namibian case, of course, a neighbor to South Africa, after you know, right up until 1990 there was a border war in South Africa. So I just wonder if people who haven't heard of the Majimaji Rebellion might want to understand a bit more about that. Sarah, I wonder if on either case, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. Oh, sorry. Maybe while Sarah's getting on.
Sorry.
Oh, there we go.
Apologize. So you want to talk about Majimaji in general, or about relationship between British colonialism and German colonialism?
Any aspect of that relationship between British colonialism and okay. German colonialism. So okay. Take your pick.
Okay, I've done more work on the South African and Namibian case. That's why I just wanted to ask. This actually takes me back, because for the last 10 or 12 years, I've actually been working on post-war connections between Africa and the former East Germany. So this is taking me back a ways to my previous project. But there was a definite there was a definite sort of tense relation between the British and the Germans sort of along that border between the colonies of Namibia and South Africa. And it was also a very porous border, so that there were like people, it was sometimes difficult to determine, like, in a sense, where you were, whether you were in a British area or a German area, in a sort of a way, right? And there was also the enclave of Walvis Bay that was in Namibia. And all of those were like spots, it was like spots where the German and the British sort of colonial powers sort of came into conflict. And again, reaching back into my memory on this a little bit, I remember I gave a paper many years ago, probably 20 years ago or so, about an individual who was committed some sort of a crime, or I don't even know if it really was a crime, was, I think, accused of doing something with in relation to the Herero uprising. And then he fled to Walvis Bay, which again was a British enclave within Namibia, and to avoid actually being, put on trial and presumably killed in Southwest Africa. And the British actually protected him, but there was all this going back and forth about it. So there was a lot of negotiation in terms of different laws that the British and the Germans had, and also a lot of confusion over who belonged where and what law should be implemented where. So that's what I'll say. Again, I have to go back quite a ways for that. So
Thank you. Adam?
Yes, briefly, for those that in the audience that might not be as familiar with the Majimaji Rebellion compared to the Herero Nama, in essence, as Sarah and Jürgen have said before, it occurred in what was at the time German East Africa, it was called. And if memory serves me correctly, it primarily occurred between 1905 and 1907. So very much in this very violent moment, eliminatory moment in Germany's colonial project. And it specifically, again, nothing is monolithic, but in this specific case, it was the outgrowth, this horrific violence was the outgrowth of Karl Peters and his investors and his other co-workers, if you will, that were attempting to cultivate the land for their own economic purposes, specifically around cotton and making cotton a cash crop. And of course, when one does that, and in this horrific situation, what does that do? If you're only allowing certain people to grow certain things, that also means then that you're subsequently not growing foodstuffs and products that can turn into actually something that can sustain a person and her or his family and community. And so that's really the one of the more principal factors that lead to this, again, rebellion, and then the really violent efforts to put it down. And I think either Jürgen or Sarah can correct me, but I believe it's somewhere in between 150 and 200,000 souls are lost, specifically Africans, during this 3-year period of time. So in a nutshell, that is what we're really talking about here. And again, it fits this eliminatory discussion, I think, in a lot of ways. With respect to connections between the German colonial project and British, I think that my fellow panelists and have really discussed a lot of those during the pre and formal so-called colonial periods. I think the greatest example is something that Jürgen just mentioned a second ago. There's connections today that we see because both governments are very resident to relinquish everything from artifacts to, in the case of Germany, remains. Let's not forget this. Thank you, Sarah, very much. It's actually up to 300,000. Thank you in the chat. But specifically artifacts, remains, art, everything that was stolen during these periods in time. So I think that is unfortunately one of the clearest ways that we could talk about the comparisons, and in this case, the legacy of these colonial projects and how they play out in the present day.
Yes, I think it's in some ways it's shocking that the Majimaji Rebellion isn't better known, considering the scale of the deaths and the horrific impact on the population in Tanzania, with modern day Tanzania, than German Southeast Africa. So I wonder, coming back to Jürgen, I mean, even in that case, there is again another important turning point in colonial policy that happens with the trade early on in Kaiser Wilhelm's reign around Heligoland and Zanzibar. And it sort of seems to me that power relationship in some ways hasn't changed. This trade making of powerful bodies based in Europe, and yet the actual impact, as you said quite rightly before, is on African people, colonized people. Then, of course, in a very different context and with horrific consequences in terms of deaths. But today, all continuing structural poverty, the impacts go on. I just wonder if you might want to say something about that relationship between, I suppose, the center and the periphery, or the global north and the global south, as people might describe it now.
Well, yes. I mean, this is now the point where one has to say that it's a pity that we have nobody from Namibia, Tanzania, or Cameroon on this panel, because that is something we really. I mean, I feel not competent or comfortable to talk how Namibians or Tanzanians feel now about colonialism, and I think that is something which should at least be mentioned. I would like to come back to about the British and the collaboration, because we concentrate on 1915 and the British, the South African military forces collecting evidence for German wrongdoings, and the Herero genocide being on the top of it. But at the same time, I mean, a few years back, Germany would not have been able to conduct the war in Namibia without British support, without Southern African support. So there is an alliance of colonial powers. At the they are rivals, but the moment a local nation resists, there is an alliance of all colonial powers, because the danger is far too great that one, if there's a successful resistance, this would serve as a model, as a precedent for others. So it's very similar to now paying reparations. Again, you can criticize other nations, but you cannot allow. There's no interest in the societies of the nations, of the states, of the governments of the global north, that any one of them pays reparations, which is, by the way, explains why the Namibians, the Herero Nama, have such a hard time getting anywhere, because there's no international pressure. I mean, if you compare, I mean, Germany had to be pressured in all sorts of concessions and attempts to make good for past misdeeds after 1945. There's always international pressure. And it was always pressure from other states of the global north. And this is completely missing in this case. And that's why they're getting nowhere. But we have to understand colonialism, and that is what you learn from Joseph Conrad, that all of Europe contributes to the making of Mr. Kurtz. That is the essence.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'd also agree with the point about a speaker from Namibia or Tanzania. And indeed, if there is anyone in the audience who knows someone who might be interested in speaking, then please do get in touch with the library, because I think we'd be really keen to organise an event. So that does bring us to the end of our time, which has flown by for me, because it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I don't know if any of you, we probably do have time for just a sentence or two of concluding thoughts. So we start with you, Sarah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, just piggybacking off of what Jürgen said, this really made me think about, and this is something I've talked about with my students over in the class I'm teaching now, actually on British Empire. We're talking about the reparations that were given to former members of Mau Mau in Great Britain, what was it, 2013, 2014, as a result of the work that a couple of historians did, where they uncovered information about the concentration camps that the British had during the Mau Mau incident, Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s. So that material came to light, And so in a sense, the British were sort of compelled to give reparations. But what I've then heard from people who were involved, like David Anderson, who is one of the main scholars who was involved in bringing that stuff to light, along with Caroline Elkins, and also from one of his students, Dan Hodgkinson, who works in Zimbabwe, I've heard that after that happened, the British sort of have been sure to not to allow the release of papers related to other instances of colonial violence in other places like Malaya or in Rhodesia and places like that, that they've been sort of sure to keep that sort of down. So, and I think that it always is right in their interest, even today, of the Western powers to not necessarily to deny, but to deflect, I suppose, is the best way maybe to put it. Deny, deflect. But anyway, that's just what I wanted to add on. And thank you so much for inviting me.
It's been a pleasure. Adam.
Yes, thank you. I promise also to be brief, Toby, just to say that I just not just to be agreeable, but again, what Jürgen and Sarah have been talking a lot about. I think the second half of this conversation, awareness is going to be key, I think. And again, I'm hopeful. I will remain hopeful that an equitable form, even if they don't call it reparations, an equitable form of agreement can be arrived upon that specifically will be generated and focused more on Herero and Nama, and not just some kind of high off a political agreement between states. And I think if it unfortunately does involve, I mean, when I say unfortunately, I really hope countries in the global north get involved. But what I hope is we don't always fall into this cycle where something is only important when a global north power gets involved, which I know is not what Jürgen was suggesting at all. It was more of just, it's unfortunate that seemingly is always the case. But in my effort, it's not necessarily through scholarship that I think I'll be able to make hopefully a small effort in that. It's in the classes we teach. I make it a point to focus an entire semester on European colonialism in Wyoming, of all places. You might not necessarily think of that. And in the context of Wyoming, fully aware that I am living in a place that is the result of a settler colonialism. I think that makes for a powerful comparison and something for all of us to reflect about here. And hopefully in the future that will lead to more awareness and then eventually understanding that violence does occur in these colonial projects.
Thank you, Adam. Actually, before I turn to you, Jürgen, I have had a message from Anna Manyanza, who said she'd like to speak. So I'm going to make her co-host, if that's okay. I'm probably breaking some guidelines about how I should be running the event. But Jürgen, are you okay with me asking Anna for some reflections? Yeah, Anna. Anna, are you able to unmute? I'm hoping.
Yes.
Hi, Anna. So
Hi.
Oh, hi, welcome to the event. So
Thank
please, as Jürgen says, absolutely, we think some reflections from somebody from Tanzania or Namibia would be really, really appropriate. So please introduce yourself.
First of all, thank you for having me. And I would be very much happy if I was speaking Kiswahili, my mother tongue, from Tanzania, but I think many of you won't understand me. I followed this talk and it's very important. But to me, it's a bit more theoretical because people from Tanzania or people from Namibia are missing to express their ideas about the issue, because my grandfather showed me about the issue about the Germans and so on. And there was an issue about colonial violence, which has been discussed here. And to me, it is very important because I remember my grandfather used to say bad words to us in German. And I didn't understand what it meant. And then he said, I don't understand, but the Germans tell us these words. So you see, about colonial violence, it's not just from colonizers, Germans to Africans, but also from Africans to Africans, because they got it from colonial masters, if you will. And this is very important to me, and I'm happy that I got this chance to take part in this discussion. And I learned a lot, and many things which happened in Tanzania has just been discussed here. And this is really, really crucial to me. Yes, thank you so much.
Fantastic. Well, would you mind emailing us afterwards, Anna, because we'd really love to be in touch with you and see if there might be opportunities for us to organise a future event with any of your contacts. So please do get in touch.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes, I will write it down.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I think we have run quite a bit over time. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us. I wish everyone a very good evening. Probably everyone wants their dinner now. So goodbye, everyone. Thank you.